I'm Tasha Keeney from ARK Invest. I'm here with Daniel Maguire. Today, we're going to answer your questions on the upcoming SpaceX IPO. After today's live, stay tuned. On Wednesday, we're going to have Kathy, Brett, and Charlie talking about the upcoming IPO wave in general. And let's kick it off for today. Daniel is going to start it with a disclosure.
Sure. The information provided in today's conversation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute an offer, solicitation, or recommendation regarding any investment product or service. Any reference to a particular company is not an endorsement by ARK nor a recommendation by ARK to buy, sell, or hold any security. ARK and its clients, as well as its related parties, may but not necessarily have financial interests in securities or issuers that are discussed. Historical results that may be discussed are not indications of future results. We cannot discuss any private or non-public material information of any kind. Certain statements made during today's conversations may be statements of future expectations or other forward-looking statements based on ARK's current views and assumptions and involve both known and unknown risks and uncertainties that would cause actual results, performance, or events to differ materially from those expressed or implied. ARK does not assume any obligation to update forward-looking information, and all information discussed today is subject to change without notice. In addition, certain information was obtained from sources that ARK believes to be reliable. However, ARK does not guarantee the accuracy or completeness of information obtained from any third party. Okay, Tasha. Today we got a lot of questions in online through X, YouTube, and elsewhere, and we're going to go through back and forth and share our thoughts on SpaceX's IPO. Tasha, for the first question, based on the actual prospectus factual profits of the companies in the IPO mix, why do investors feel the combined company of SpaceX will do better? And are there any numbers to support that statement?
Yes. So, I believe this is talking about the XAI merger. What I would say here is if you look at the TAM that they've laid out in the S1, the $28 trillion opportunity, they believe the majority of that is in AI. So, if you think about the orbital data center opportunity, we think that they could monetize at roughly double the rate on selling models, the XAI models to others, as opposed to just selling or renting out the compute to other model providers. So I think that tells you why it's important again to have their own models as well, in addition to being an infrastructure provider.
Yeah, exactly. And when you read the S1, it really highlights the importance of being a vertically integrated AI infrastructure company, as SpaceX is pitching to prospective investors. So for our next question, Tasha, can you break down the lockup period structure and what does that mean for investors?
Sure, I'll keep this one high level. I'll say that, as opposed to just a 6-month lockup period where then there's a cliff, there's a number of opportunities where early investors have the chance to sell some shares. We know after the first quarterly report is one, but there's also a number of dates in the S1 laid out for rolling periods where those shares can unlock. So that should sort of smooth out some of those sales or potential sales, let's say. And, it's possible that a big portion of the private shares could at least be available to trade before that 6-month period.
Great. So for our next question, it's on the hot word of the last couple of months, orbital data centers. The question sent in asked, what does the timeline for data centers in space look like and how big of an opportunity is it? So firstly, for timeline, it's important to state that there's already been a private company that sent a GPU to space called StarCloud, who have trained a large language model demonstrating its capabilities. There's also public companies who have put out research papers discussing the idea too. Specifically to SpaceX, they have identified 2028 as the year that they intend to launch their first AI satellite. As it relates to sizing, in the S1, SpaceX lay out a $28.5 trillion total addressable market, of which $26.5 trillion relates to AI initiatives. And as Tasha mentioned earlier, the way really to think about that is when you have your orbital compute in space, you can do one of two things. You can use it as an infrastructure as a service play, as demonstrated by the Anthropic deal on the ground, where they're leasing, it was just announced today through the amended S1, 325,000 NVIDIA GPUs for roughly $15 billion per year. Alternatively, for 2 to 3x more than that, you can leverage your own large language model and monetize your token outputs, which is a much more lucrative opportunity and some of the rationale behind the XAI acquisition back in February 2026.
Right. So I believe at scale, they've said that they're targeting 100 gigawatts per year. And as Daniel mentioned, less than 1 gigawatt right now is being monetized at $15 billion annually. And you can imagine that, again, they could get possibly double if they on-sell models instead of renting out that compute.
Great. So our next question is on what are the biggest risks or roadblocks to overcoming SpaceX for SpaceX to overcome in order to make these data centers viable? Well, I think the common theme in the SpaceX S1 is really the importance of Starship. For context, for those of you unaware, Starship is SpaceX's next generation rocket. It intends to be fully and rapidly reusable, both bottom stage and upper stage. This will be the first time a company has ever achieved it. And that poses several risks with that. One particular one to call out is the upper stage called Starship. When that re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, it undergoes immense heat, and SpaceX is developing heat tiles to help overcome that. We've seen over the last couple of flight tests, most notably Flight Test 12, that a lot of the heat shields are starting to demonstrate capabilities to overcome that heat. And this is important because if you can imagine when the Starship re-enters Earth, you want to just have a quick scan and look at the Starship that it's ready to go again in order to support Elon's vision to launch thousands of these a year. And then as it relates to specifically on in space, a lot of people speak about radiation or the size of radiators and mass of radiators. It seems like that SpaceX, through its TerraFab initiative, will likely design its own chips at which they could potentially operate at higher temperatures than terrestrial chips, which in turn can help reduce the mass of radiators. But if there's any company that can solve problems in space, I think SpaceX is well positioned to do so, given the 10,000 active satellites they have in today through its Starlink initiative.
Yeah, and maybe Daniel, you can talk a little bit about what full reusability means for launch costs, because we've done a lot of work there.
Yeah, so maybe for viewers who aren't aware of the concept of Wright's law, this is foundational to a lot of the research we do here at ARC. It states that for every cumulative doubling of a given metric, costs decline by a constant percentage. In the case of rockets, it's cumulative doubling of kilograms or up mass sent to orbit, and SpaceX has demonstrated a 17% decline in launch costs. This has resulted in the Falcon 9, which is the dominant rocket in the industry today, cutting launch costs by roughly 95% since 2008. And that has opened up many opportunities in space, most notably the Starlink internet connectivity, which has surpassed 10 million active subscribers. And we know it's a cash flow positive business since 2023. Starship, as Tasha mentioned, through full reusability, we estimate could cut launch costs from roughly $1,000 per kilogram today to sub $100 per kilogram. And that order of magnitude decline in launch costs is really critical for opening up many more opportunities that at today's launch prices just aren't economically possible. The most notable one is the Orbital data center opportunity.
Right. So it's crucial to get full reusability with Starship really to enable orbital data centers. And that's what makes them more economic than building them on the ground. So that's a huge roadblock. I would add, roadblock, I should say that's a risk to look out for. I would add that chip acquisition is another one. We know that SpaceX plans on developing their own chips and producing their own chips through the TerraFab project. They also could acquire these potentially, or use other companies' chips, and launch them into space. And we know that there is quite a big backlog because everyone is racing to get as much compute as possible. So certainly that acquisition, another risk, and also a lot of risk with building their own chips in house. But we've heard them say that they believe that they think between SpaceX and Tesla that they would use roughly a terawatt annually. So there is a need for this project.
Great. So our next question, Tasha, is on SpaceX being a controlled company. It was certainly a prominent piece at the beginning of the S1, controlled by Elon Musk. And what benefit is that to the company, do you believe?
Sure. I'd say that, we believe that having Elon Musk at the helm is incredibly important to this company. And in general, we see him as a major driver of both innovation at his companies as well as talent acquisition. So we'd say that it's quite important that he, retains his position there.
Yeah, agreed. So then is kind of taking a step back from SpaceX. And the next question is on the impact of the recent Blue Origin explosion on SpaceX and also the entire space industry in general. I think the first thing to say is it's important that no one was injured, thankfully, but this does have a lot of knock-on impacts on the industry. Importantly, this was Blue Origin's only facility for launching its New Glenn rocket, which is the partially reusable rocket that has launched 3 times. It was preparing for its 4th time and unfortunately blew up on stand. And why this is notable is that just earlier in the week, NASA awarded Blue Origin a contract for close to $470 million to land lunar terrain vehicles on the moon. So the knock-on implications of this is that really the industry, as it has been doing for the last 10 years, is going to rely on SpaceX's rockets more than ever before, notably its Starship program, particularly for its moon ambitions in the moon base and returning humans to the moon. And then also it opens up the launch market for other providers, both in the public space and then also in the private space. And it really highlights the importance of having multiple launch providers, of which today there aren't too many to name. But yeah, I think that that's kind of summarizes the high level of the implications of the Blue Origin explosion.
And maybe Daniel, you could touch on what specifically why is this explosion such a big deal involving the pad as opposed to just say a rocket exploding?
Sure. For those of you avid space fans, you may have heard Elon speak over previous Starship flight tests that the biggest success if it gets away from the launch pad, and it can blow up in space, but just don't blow up on the launch pad. And that's critical because if you blow up on the launch pad, unless you have alternatives to launching the rocket, it's not possible to launch your rocket. In Blue Origin's case, unfortunately, this was their only launch pad, Launch Complex 36 in Florida's Space Coast. So as a result of the explosion, it's likely that it's probably going to rule them out from launching New Glenn for another year. That said, they are building additional complexes, but I suspect that it likely won't be ready in the foreseeable next 12 months or so. And as I mentioned, then you have all the knock-on implications both for Blue Origin, SpaceX, and the NASA industry as a whole. Okay, so returning to SpaceX then, as we mentioned, SpaceX has a $28.5 trillion total addressable market, or TAM, included in the S1. It mentioned Starship, Orbital AI, and also the ultimate mission of SpaceX of making humanity multiplanetary. Tasha, what do you think is the bull case for investors out there? Are we really looking at a multi-trillion-dollar company opportunity, or what do we think here at ARC?
Sure. So again, I would highlight what we've said earlier is that we think one of the largest opportunities here is really orbital data centers. Again, that target of 100 gigawatts a year. We know they can monetize 1 gigawatt at more than 15 billion, and that's just on selling the compute itself. Of course, with models that would actually be higher. So we do see this as a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity. Again, with orbital AI really taking up a large chunk. But Daniel, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Starlink opportunity, and ARC has done some work on this in the past.
SpaceX included in their S1, they believe connectivity could be roughly $1.6 trillion total addressable market. And this is enabled by launch costs. As I mentioned earlier, the Falcon 9 rocket, we believe, has cut launch costs by 95%. At the current prices today at roughly $1,000 per kilogram, it makes a lot of economic sense to launch satellites. Each Falcon 9 rocket can launch around 29 satellites per launch. And today they have over 10,000. And it's providing connectivity to everywhere around the world for removing dead zones. Although I know a lot of people want to be connected, but it has a lot of applications, particularly in emergency scenarios, and has saved a lot of lives where terrestrial cell towers weren't able to connect people during wildfires or emergencies, and Starlink has come to the rescue. So really the near-term opportunity for cash flow generation is Starlink, and that's derived from the launch cost decline provided by the Falcon 9 partially reusable rocket.
Right. And, you mentioned this already, but, Starlink today can be thought of as like a backup, or it's in areas where you can't get access to where you couldn't previously get access to connectivity. I think the bull case would be that Starlink, provides more mainstream internet traffic. So it's not just the backup opportunity, and that probably gets you closer to that $1 trillion TAM.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you can kind of see that too, included in the S1. SpaceX mentioned the acquisition of the EchoStar spectrum, which is very important for broadening broadening both the broadband, but also the direct to cell offering that Starlink has. Again, for those of you unfamiliar, direct to cell is where you can get internet connectivity. Rather than pinging off a cell tower, you go straight to the satellite. An important part of that is spectrum, which prior to the acquisition, which I believe is yet to close, SpaceX did not have spectrum and was partnering with various players in the public market as it relates to mobile network operators. Okay, so the next question then, kind of on the control topic too, Tasha, is specifically to Elon. So Elon currently is the chief executive officer, the CTO, and the chairman with full control. How important is the ownership structure for keeping the long-term vision of SpaceX alive, which is making humanitarian multi-planetary species?
Sure. Well, we've already said in previous questions that we believe it's quite important for Elon to remain at the helm of the company. We do believe that he should be incentivized for the future success of the company. We know that from the S1, there's some quite lofty targets that need to be hit in order for him, to be incentivized further. But I would just say broadly, again, we see him as a major innovation driver for SpaceX, for his other companies as well. We've already seen him through his other companies and SpaceX as well, really accomplish what was previously thought impossible. Daniel talked about low-cost launch services that SpaceX provides today. We think those costs will decline even further. And really, we do believe that Elon was a major driving force in just making the impossible possible here. So we do believe he's quite important to the company.
Yeah, and the next question we have is actually a great example of the research we do at ARC and the topic of convergence. So it's on the convergence of cryptocurrency and maybe reusable rockets for SpaceX. So Tasha, Elon and SpaceX have just close to $1.5 billion in Bitcoin. Why did SpaceX build such a large position, and what do you think the plan is for it post IPO?
Sure. We've seen with other companies that they've acquired. It looks as if SpaceX acquired this earlier, let's say like 4 or 5 years ago, and that it's likely that they're treating it as a treasury asset. And actually, in ARC's research, we put out a lot of great research on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general. But in our previous research, you can see that we've actually highlighted the opportunity for Bitcoin to be used as a corporate treasury asset. So it appears as if that is the use case here as well.
Yeah, great. And it's funny how the space evolves. If you'd asked us maybe 5, 10 years ago about a rocket company and cryptocurrency, I'm sure a lot of people would laugh, but that's just the exciting times we live in today. So the next question is on the S1, and specifically Starship, as we've mentioned, is very critical to SpaceX, and also just a lot of space transportation in general. And the question is on, well, what milestones should we look out for in the next 12 to 24 months, and how soon could Starship fly cargo and crew to Mars? So firstly, I would say, or we would say that ARC is a 5-year time horizon for all of our investment opportunities. But as it relates to the next 12 to 24 months, really, it's progress on Starship V3. So what V3 is, it just launched recently. It's their next generation Starship. And this is critical because it's going to be the Starship that they start to commercialize services with. By commercialization, we mean deploying satellites in the PEZ dispenser manner as it does to launch bandwidth to orbit and really monetize that and grow the Starlink constellation. And this is important because each Starship launch can add more than 20 times bandwidth today than the Falcon 9 rocket. And that's a combination because of the larger rocket and upmass to orbit, as well as the more compelling and bandwidth-powered satellites that Starlink V3 are. So as it relates to flying cargo and to the Mars, so SpaceX has indicated in its S1 it's hoping to deploy some of the Starlink satellites in 2026. We mentioned earlier 2028 being orbital AI compute, and specifically to Mars. For those of you who aren't aware, the Mars transfer window is a concept where you can only really launch to Mars every 26 months, specifically, or roughly 2 years. The next window is 2026, the end of this year, and subsequently every 2 years. It's unlikely they'll launch this year. It's also probably unlikely they'll launch in 2028, given the extreme focus on the orbital AI opportunity, which can generate a lot of cash flow for really fulfilling the mission of SpaceX to be a multi-planetary species. And really, that's why you've seen a shift in the last year or so of increased focus on the moon. And that's because the moon, you can reach the moon roughly every 10 days, give or take, compared to 2 years and you can start to build out a moon base. And that's why it's critical as part of the NASA announcement and building moon base there. And also a knock-on effect, as we mentioned, about the Blue Origin New Glenn rocket exploding. It's possible that NASA will lean on SpaceX and Starship even more for launching humans and cargo to the moon. But Tasha, I don't know if you've anything to add there.
Yeah, well, maybe you could talk a little bit about, other than getting to the moon, like what is the potential here, and what kind of amplification effects does this have on the rest of their business?
Great. So that's a great question, Tasha. And as Tasha mentioned, the plan for SpaceX, at least initially, is to launch 100 gigawatts per year of AI compute from Earth. For context, 1 gigawatt is like a large nuclear reactor you'd see Homer Simpson in The Simpsons working at. So that's a pretty large deployment of power. However, when they get to the moon through a lunar mass driver, SpaceX's intention is to increase that to 1 terawatt a year. So this is an enormous leap in power deployment, and really that's because of the gravity on the moon. You don't need a large rocket to counteract the gravity we have on Earth, so you can launch a lot more mass. So that's kind of really one of the opportunities. And then they also mentioned other things in the S1, like asteroid mining, which maybe, again, 10, 15 years ago, people would have laughed at. But given the declining launch costs and the opportunity that's opening up in space, it's a viable business in the medium to long term.
Right. Yeah. Both probably long-term opportunities, would you say? Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've talked a lot about Starlink, talked a lot about launches. Tasha, what do you think? Maybe I've teased it here and spoiled the answer just there, but what are the most exciting space exploration projects SpaceX has coming that most people don't know about yet?
Sure. Well, in terms of, well, Daniel mentioned asteroid mining. I think in addition to that, we're certainly looking forward to hearing more of the details on how Terrafab will play out. We know they've announced some public partners there, but just in terms of sort of like the timeline, and also how are the logistics going to work for them producing their own chips. Still a lot to be seen there, but again, they've highlighted the need for compute and the opportunity. So we think it makes sense that they're pursuing this project, but just some uncertainty, and we're looking forward to hearing more information. And I'd say the same about other opportunities like asteroid mining, the mass driver. The logistics in terms of exactly how this would work, I think, are yet to be seen. But again, we've seen Elon, through his companies, accomplish what previously sounded crazy. So whether or not you think these are crazy ideas, it seems like maybe this is the company to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe just one other business line to mention is point-to-point travel with Starship. So going from one place in the world to another place in the world a lot faster than a commercial airline. But again, that's likely more on the longer term. So for our next question, it's on the IPO again, Tasha. So do you view this as like a massive liquidity exit for insiders and early cash out for some of the VC investors who invested in SpaceX several years ago, or how do we view it here at ARC?
Yeah, certainly early investors. It looks like they're set up to get a great return on an investment here, and there will be the opportunity to trade those shares around. I would say at ARK Invest, we're really focused on the long term opportunity. When we invest in companies, we're looking at a 5 to 10 year horizon, and we are long term holders of innovation stocks in general. And so I would say that that's really our focus. What other investors will do remains to be seen. But as active investors, we can certainly take advantage of any price movements.
Great. So the next two questions, we kind of touched on it a lot. I don't know, Tash, if you have anything to add, but the first one is kind of on lockup periods, which we've spoken to at length, and then also the opportunity that AI infrastructure could become for SpaceX. So that maybe the next more relevant question that we haven't touched on really is SpaceX's lead with Starship versus what anyone else is developing. Maybe to put some context, SpaceX has a 10-year lead on the industry. And what we mean by that is that in 2015, SpaceX landed its Orbital class booster, which is the bottom part of the rocket. It has reused it and executed almost perfect reusability since 2015. The closest competitor, which we've spoken about a bit, is Blue Origin, and they landed their Orbital class booster in 2025. So a 10-year lead on the industry SpaceX has on partial reusability. Notably, that's partial reusability. This comes at a time when SpaceX is full steam ahead on full reusability with Starship, so both the bottom super heavy booster and the upper Starship stage, which, as we've mentioned at length here, we believe could cut launch costs by an order of magnitude and open up many more opportunities in the space industry. Okay, great. So maybe to pick on some of the questions that have been coming in since we started. Tasha, on terrestrial energy, a lot of people speak about NIMBYism and it becoming very expensive. Do you think if it gets cheap, does the case for compute on satellites collapse? Is that argument out the window? Should terrestrial NIMBYism be disappeared overnight?
Yeah. Well, I would say, Daniel, and given your work on energy in general, it's hard to see the hurdles here on Earth going away anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned NIMBYism. There's also a huge backlog for generators.
Yep.
There's just a need for a lot more power globally. As Daniel mentioned, that lower cost launch really provides a great opportunity for orbital compute. But yeah, maybe you could share some of your research on energy.
This question was from Trustoff, so a great question, and I'd actually encourage you to look at our Big Ideas 2026 report. We have a full section on energy, and it talks about the convergence with rockets. But I think it's important to state that energy is really the foundation to every economy, and more energy is good. And when you look back at history, particularly during the internet boom, and there was a lot of concern about moving the economy to the web, economies became more efficient over time, and we expect that to continue with artificial intelligence. And why orbital data centers has emerged kind of out of the blue is because of, as Tasha mentioned, a lot of the NIMBYism. If you want to connect to the US grid, it's a 5-year wait time. Gas turbines are sold out till the end of the decade. At ARC here, we're big believers in nuclear energy, but it's really been plagued with regulatory constraint, albeit it's changing in the last kind of year to two. But they're kind of multi-year 2030 solutions. So Elon looked at the state of play on Earth and decided, well, you know what? We have a 10-year lead in space. We can launch satellites at an unprecedented level compared to some of our competitors, and let's leverage the power there. So, at ARC, we believe more power is good, and hopefully a lot of the terrestrial constraints do relax, and that can help the build out of nuclear, wind, solar, and other renewables. But we believe that more power is good, and we don't think that's a headwind for orbital compute at all. Okay, great. So the next question is Peter from YouTube. So Peter's asking, what is about the cost of relaunching satellites after their average life in space, and what is the average life currently? So the average life for satellites today is roughly a 5-year time horizon. And the way to think about this, particularly from the AI compute landscape, is that if you launch orbital data centers, and we know SpaceX is filed with the FCC for up to 1 million satellites in space, if should there be an issue with like one of the satellites, it's not a single point of failure. It's just a node in the network. You can deorbit it and launch pretty much on the same day. And as it relates to timelines, as I said, it's every 5 years. And then that also helps with chip development because the quality of chips are moving so fast. When you deploy a lot of chips on terrestrial and it's in a one solution networked together, it's a lot more difficult to increase the chip capacity and deploy more cutting edge chips. Whereas orbital compute can kind of overcome that hurdle through having a distributed source of power. Okay, great. So the next question is on Wright's law. I think, Ben, if you want to scroll down, I think I just saw the top of it. Great, thanks. How does Wright's law hold when the input isn't a manufactured good getting cheaper, but a refined material getting scarcer and weaponized? So I think for this question, we can, again, I'd refer people to our Big Ideas, but we spoke about Wright's law for specific manufacturing, but we also do it for gigabits per second or bandwidth in orbit, which is arguably something you can't manufacture. For this case, we estimate that bandwidth per dollar per bandwidth declines by roughly 44% for every cumulative doubling of bandwidth you have in orbit. And that is why Starship is so important. As we mentioned, Starship can launch more than 20x the bandwidth than Falcon 9 can per launch. And then that accelerates your cumulative doubling of bandwidth, making satellite costs a lot cheaper, which can then make it ubiquitous for everyone on Earth and remove all the dead zones. But Tasha.
Yeah, I would just add to that, if this question is sort of getting at, materials themselves that we've seen through Elon's other companies, that they've overcome supply challenges. And there's a couple ways to do that. There could be a call to action to produce, or refine more of the material, and sort of get the supply chain going that way. But you can also you can try to engineer around materials as you go forward. Of course, depending on exactly what that is, we don't think it's like necessarily possible to remove sort of any material choice here. I'm not saying that. It's more that I think that we've seen his companies get creative in the past with supply challenges, and I would expect the same to happen here if there were to be any challenges.
Great. We have another question from Trustoff, whose keyboard must be on fire. Some great questions coming in, but the question is on Earth observation and market consolidation. But I think the tone of the question really imports or touches on an important point, and it asks about vertical integration for constellations relative to just doing the constellation yourself. And maybe I can start, and Tasha, you can add. But we believe vertical integration is key. The most recent data point is the Blue Origin launch or explosion, last week, which has put a lot of satellite providers in a tricky situation. There's some of the public players who've come out and have explicitly stated that they don't have the launch capacity to match with their manufacturing capability for building satellites, and it's really holding them back. So we believe vertical integration is critical for rockets, and that's why SpaceX is commanding such a large potential rumored valuation in its IPO. But Tasha, do you want to maybe touch on the broad topic of vertical integration?
Sure. I mean, we see with innovation broadly that there's a lot of advantage to verticalizing, particularly if you're the first player to really create an industry. But, at ARC, we invest in the leaders, the enablers, and the beneficiaries of our technologies. So we really look, across the value chain there. But again, we think there's both great benefit to verticalization, and I would add, that we see, again, just as a broad trend here, this idea of convergence, which we talk a lot about ARC Invest. At ARC, we invest in 15 technologies across 5 innovation platforms, and we see quite a bit of convergence there. I mean, AI is probably the easiest one to point to today. It's really permeating nearly every industry, but many of our technologies, energy is one of them. We see, being cross-sector and really cross-industry. So verticalization tends to be a benefit there.
Great. I see we've gotten another question in from Gig Solutions, who asks about having data centers in space and heat dissipation, which hasn't been solved yet. We kind of touched on it earlier, but the traditional means of cooling GPUs in Earth through water don't work in space because it's a vacuum. The means of doing so is using radiators. The problem with radiators is that they take up a lot of mass, so you kind of want to, in space, everything about launching stuff to low Earth orbit and beyond is really all about the mass budget, and you want to reduce your mass because it saves the costs. So as we mentioned, it seems like some of the rumors are that SpaceX is going to develop a chip that operates in a lot higher temperature than would be necessary on Earth. And as a result of that, you can reduce the mass of your radiators. And as we mentioned before, if there's any company that can solve problems in space, it's definitely the company who has the most data on satellites, with over 10,000 Starlink satellites in orbit today. But Tasha.
Yeah, well, I think this isn't the spirit of the question, but maybe you can just talk a little bit about SpaceX's leading position here. I mean, of course, in the satellite space, but what of the up mass that's gone into orbit, what is SpaceX? How big are they just compared to the rest of the industry, to give our listeners an idea of like how much information they receive back?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the 10,000 satellites, that's active Starlink. In terms of up mass or kilograms sent to orbit, last year SpaceX had more than 80% of that. The remaining 20%, a lot of it's dominated by China, but they don't have reusable rockets. A lot of it is expendable, so you launch the rocket and you lose it, which is very expensive. And then the balance is kind of some of the public providers as well as some private ones. And then as it relates to the satellites in space in general, SpaceX, I think in the S1 disclosed that they have roughly 75% of maneuverable objects in space. So that just gives you a context of the dominance that they have in orbit, and really all of the data gathering capabilities that offers to fine tune the shift from maybe communication satellites to AI sats. Okay, great. And then this is going to be our last question of the live stream, but it comes from a user. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that name. I'll probably mispronounce it, but ends in 981. And it's, what is the cost implication of creating power in space versus Earth? So, Tasha, do you want to take a first stab, or I can go?
Sure. So, I mean, because of the sun, which Elon and SpaceX have highlighted, we really underuse the power of the sun. Certainly on Earth today, you can imagine that power is really free in space. But Daniel, maybe you could talk about sort of exactly what does that mean?
Yeah. So again, not to sound like a broken record, but it's really critical to all of this, and it's declining launch costs. So Brett Winton, our chief futurist, as part of our Big Ideas report, has a great slide on this, but it looks at the threshold where orbital compute could be cost competitive with terrestrial compute. Our research suggests that tipping point is around $300 per kilogram. So again, down from roughly $1,000 per kilogram today. And then at scale, when you get to the sub $100 per kilogram, we believe it could be 25% cheaper than terrestrial compute. So that just kind of puts some of the numbers to it. And again, it's all in our Big Ideas, which has a lot more detail than some of the topics on some of the topics we're discussing today.
Great. And I think that wraps up our live today. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. Make sure to tune in Wednesday at 3:15 p.m. Again, we have Kathy, Brett, and Charlie from ARC. They're going to discuss the upcoming IPO wave. That's it for me and Daniel today. And please continue to check out our research.
Thanks, everyone.